Nashville became the home of Gibson in the early 70s, 1974. They started moving it from Kalamazoo, where it had been since 1894. Nashville, for decades now, has been the home of American popular music. Originally it was New York. It moved to LA. Now it's Nashville. So many of the great LA players have been Nashville residents now for decades. So it makes sense to be in the middle of where music is created if you're creating things for music. It's great to have that resource of some of the greatest musicians in the world, certainly some of the greatest guitarists in the world, in Nashville. Or you say, hey, do you mind coming on down and trying this out, or can we bring this out to you, tell me what you think, all that kind of stuff. So it's the right place to be. Gibson USA, that's where we build the majority of our Les Pauls, SGs, Flying Vs, etc. That's our solid body mecca, and we build a lot of guitars there. If you ever get a chance to take a tour, bring your walking shoes, because it'll take you a while to get from one end to the other. Probably on average, maybe 500 people working in there. And our people tend to stay. We don't have a lot of turnover. We have a lot of people that have been doing a lot of the same jobs for many, many years. And they have the opportunity to grow in their positions. You know, the old story of Fred Green, who started out as the janitor in USA and ended up as the general manager. He ended up running the place. So there's great opportunity there for the people that work there. They're proud of what they do. What they do really well. Everything is built there. So there's no components that come from any place else except for hardware. Bridges, tuning machines, the metal parts and pieces. We make all of our own pickups there. Of course, we invented the humbucker pickup. We've always made our own pickups. Lloyd Loar back in the 1920s was experimenting with amplifying stringed instruments. But the P90 pickup has been a part of Gibson since the 1930s. Big, sweet, single coil on steroids, rings like a bell P90 pickup. In 1957, credit goes to Seth Lever, who was an engineer at Gibson, for coming up with the humbucker pickup. The reality is, at Gibson, a lot of people work on projects together, but he gets the credit for it. So we came up with the humbucker pickup, and that was, as everybody knows, two coils side by side to cancel the hum that came through the single coil pickups of the day. But we've always made our own pickups from day one. It still takes 52 sets of hands to build a Gibson USA guitar. People are surprised when they go out there when they see how much handwork it is. There are a lot of things that we could automate, a number of things. But putting binding on a guitar, you don't see binding on many electric guitars these days because it's so expensive in terms of labor. And then once you get the binding fit to the guitar and glued on, and the guitar dries overnight and slows you down in your production, then you've got to trim that binding to fit the guitar. And then when it gets to the end of the line, these knuckleheads spray colored lacquer all over it so you can't see it anyway. And so then it goes back to very skilled people sitting at workbenches that scrape binding so you can see the binding again. Perfect, thin, straight lines. It's that kind of handwork that's out there that people don't realize today in modern manufacturing, especially in America. Every sunburst is still sprayed by one of just a few people. And those people have been spraying our sunbursts forever. It's all by hand. Wet sanding is by hand, buffing is by hand. We've got resaw in the back. Some people call it sawmill. We call it resaw because we don't cut up logs, we cut up boards. Obviously, we use a great deal of mahogany. Gibson is the Mahogany company. There are a lot of species of wood on the market today. They have the term mahogany in them. There's only one true mahogany. For years, people have referred to it as Honduras mahogany. By and large, it hasn't come from Honduras for decades and decades and decades because that was wiped out eons ago. Sweetenia macrophylla is the genus. That's the Lithuanian term for mahogany. Spell that backwards. At any rate, mahogany comes from southern Mexico, Central America, into South America, about halfway down, plus the southern tip of Florida. That's where it naturally comes from. Years ago, it was put on the CITES Treaty because mahogany has been the hardwood of choice long before they were using it in guitars. Going back several hundred years, they were cutting down rainforests left and right to get the mahogany. It's pretty strict bunch of folks. We use certified wood. We have used as much certified wood as we can find since 1986. But at the end of the day, what it means is that the raw materials that we're using is sustainable. It's coming from managed plantations. Recently, it was in the news that we made a deal with the government of Fiji. After World War II, there were some mahogany plantations planted in Fiji. It's not native to that part of the world. There is mahogany-like material that comes from there. They call it Luan mahogany, that kind of things. You know, there's African mahogany from Africa. It's not really mahogany, like I said. The bad news is it's really hard to get. All hardwoods over the years have gotten more and more expensive. And then we get in these big long boards, 20, 30 foot long boards, and we can't use all of it. You know, we've got guys that go through and grade the board, and so they'll mark with chalk parts of the board that we can use for bodies or necks or, you know, whatever. People wonder why guitars cost some money. Well, you know, handmade, raw materials, made out of wood, doesn't grow on trees these days. Plus, you can't find wood in the dimensions that it used to be in. The mahogany trees that are harvested are younger than the big old trees of years gone past. It's very difficult because the trees aren't that big. So when we do a one-piece body these days, it's on the more expensive stuff, obviously on custom shop guitars, things like that. Maple. Maple is a domestic hardwood. It grows everywhere. That's great news. Still, the same issues apply. The wood has to be certifiable. And then it's very select. So you can't just order boards of maple. Small percentage of the maple that grows will ever be the proper specs to become a guitar. And then when you're talking about figured maple, flame maple, bird's eye maple, quilted maple, figure happens in a maple tree. It happens in almost all trees, but it happens in a maple tree, maybe in 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 trees. Depends on who you talk to. But it's very rare. And there's no predicting where that tree is going to be. So it's not easy to find. And we do use modern technology, like using the plec. That was one advance in technology that even Gibson couldn't deny works. So all of our guitars that we build these days, all of our divisions, the final setup is by plec. And the plec machine, essentially, the guitar hangs in the machine so that there's no tension on the neck. It's not influenced one way or another. Just the truss rod holds it in a certain position. And that machine analyzes every square inch of the fingerboard times 6 strings. And then it cuts the nut to within 1,000th of an inch accuracy. That's a half a hair. So pull a hair out of your head, half of that, if you can imagine. And then it goes down the fingerboard. It analyzes the fingerboard and every fret, and then it carves the frets perfectly so that everything has the exact same crown to it and the exact same dimension to it. You can't do that by hand, but players think it's worth it. So we go from the archaic, some of our old tooling and our old people like me, to the modern with the plec and everywhere in between. But it's still a hand-built instrument. If you go out to Gibson USA today, you'll see some funky old tools. Some of that stuff goes all the way back to the beginning, like the magnetizer, the little machine that magnetizes the magnets. It's always been there. There's some modern machines, winding bobbins, right next to the old ones that we used in the 60s and the 50s. So it's kind of a hybrid, it's kind of a mix. Certainly we use modern techniques and things when they make sense. But probably the biggest change was back in the day they used a mechanical counter when they wrapped the wire on the bobbins. And so you put the bobbin up in the lathe-like tool. Behind that spool of wire, you hook the wire to it and it starts turning. And you watch the counter. Well, you step across the way, grab a cup of coffee, maybe take a couple bites of your sandwich. When it gets close to 7,000 wraps or whatever it is, you hit the button on the floor and it slowly stops. Historically, original Gibson pickups were not exact. Every bobbin had a different number of wraps on it. The engineering drawings, every bobbin had the same number of wraps, and the magnet was exactly the same, and everything was exactly the same. But the reality was they weren't. And that's part of the charm of it. That's where the soul comes from in musical instruments. They're not all the same. Why do I like this one so much better than this one, and they both seem like the same to me? That's one of the reasons. So some years ago, well, I guess it's been 20 years since we came out with the 57 Classic, which was the original patent applied for Gibson humbucker pickup done according to the exact engineering specs. After a few years, our friends in Japan told us, you know, the original PAF pickups, they weren't like that. One bobbin always had more wraps of wire on it than the other. The magnets, which your magnets are very clean and very nicely dressed and quite handsome. They weren't like that. They were ugly and funky back then. They used to, cut a line in the iron bar and then snap off the magnet for the pickup. So you got a jagged edge. And they didn't buff the magnet nice and smooth and shiny. And apparently that has an effect on the magnetic field. So we took that to heart, and that's where the burstbucker came from. Burstbucker 1, 2, and 3. Since our pickups originally had varying amounts of output, even though they were theoretically the same, there's some hot, some not so hot, some pretty cool. So that's where the burstbucker pickups came from. And our custom shop took off on that. They came up with the custom bucker, refining that even more. Memphis also did something similar, refining that. The components are the original things, but we've tried to de-engineer things these days and make them a little less perfect and a little bit more like they were back in the day.